Combi Weapons. The sergeant looked down on the hell in front of him, above him, around him. All was explosions, roaring fires, falling masonry, twisted metal, shattered stone. The city looked like a half-gutted and decomposing cadaver. Its broken skyscrapers jutted out like irregular ribs, its main thoroughfare, its broken spine. Its features now marred by the all-consuming and ungentle caress of war. It had been hard fighting, and it had been long. This site, this mausoleum to martyrdom, was where they had drawn a line in the sand, had decided to make their stand. Where once they capered and rutted, where they performed their debased hedonistic foulness. Now this is where they fought for their God, they fought for their lives. This is where they beseeched their foul master, and their throats ran hoarse from the screaming of its name. But this was where the Angels of Midnight had also decided to end the matter. And it was going apace, as intended, to schedule. But that was the lie. The patterns of madness that allowed these angels to justify what they were doing. For there could be no other word for it than extermination. From the one perspective, the side of the people of Isokarian Alpha, this was unjustified slaughter. They had been alone. They had been cut off from the rest of the distant Imperium. They had been beset for months, tortured and hunted and destroyed. Their cities smashed, their entire people on the brink. For when the great tear across reality had opened, the lights went out. And the Xenos, aliens, had swept in when the Imperium was napping, and they had harvested humans like cattle on this world. They had swept across the world and killed or harvested all, before then mustering just outside of the range of the last remaining human weapons of any note, just outside of their main capital. And to the Xenos it had been more a celebration, a gathering for a festival before their attack. They had been so certain of victory that they celebrated it before the deed was even done. But none who huddled in that last city could see any way that they would fail. They had little in the way of defences, few tanks or materials of war remaining, and nothing they had done before had availed them any good. The Xenos had been too much for them even when they could field entire regiments of planetary defence forces. But on that last day, when only this, the capital, survived, it was then that the people of Isokarian were saved. In their darkest hour, on the very dawn of what considered most to be their last day, their deliverance had come. For storms had arrived out of nowhere as the enemies gathered around for their last assault. Those storms covered all before and around the city, the last human sanctuary on all of Isokarian. They raged for 6 days and 6 nights. And when they abated, when their fury was finally blown out, the Xenos were gone. All were scoured from the planet. All. The people of Isokarian were then informed, instructed, instilled with the faith of the being who had saved them. And it was not the Emperor. Some of the new priests stated it was the Prince of Pleasure, Slanesh. He'd been contacted by a single man, one who would later be made king in all but name. This man had prayed for his entire world, his entire people. He had prayed for deliverance, and they had received it. At first, the rites and ways of worshipping their new god seemed a massive festival, a carnival of colours and music and song. For their new lord, their new protector, He was unlike the dour emperor of mankind. He was a lord of life, and love, and laughter, and he celebrated them all to abundance. Yet as time went on, as it always does, the rites became more involved, less structured, more bacchanal, more extreme. And as the years passed, hedonism and debauchery became the norm. The cavorting couplings went from private affairs to writhing carpets of sweaty grunting, animalistic rutting across every road and alleyway on high days. The gutters running with blood, when the sunset and a red moon leered down on the horrors they performed upon one another in the name of their dark benefactor. And none saw how far they had fallen, how far they had stooped, until they were confronted by the returning extended family of humanity, who were, quite rightly, utterly repulsed. And they saw in one brief look that the people had turned to chaos. From the perspective of the Imperium, the world had been left to its own devices, left to look to its own defences, because there was simply no way to get to them in time. The warp routes had been cut off, the galaxy darkened for a time, and when the lights went back on, communications were possible again. Then the galaxy was ablaze. Worlds uncounted had been attacked, entire sectors had been ravaged, and in that time it was only those worlds that kept beaming out their distress cores that were placed on priority, as they were the only worlds that the overstretched forces of the Imperium could guarantee still had any populace left to defend. So Issacharion was presumed lost. And when the combined force led by the Angels of Midnight reached the world, they had expected to drop off the contents of a colony ship and move on. But instead, they found that the world had not been washed clean of humanity. Quite the opposite. It had been contaminated by them and their twisted heretical beliefs. The deliberation was less than a heartbeat in coming to decision. And so, Issacharion Alpha was then beset by an almost identical event, so similar in nearly every way. The forces of the Imperium hit, and hit hard. They set about scouring all human life from the globe. And it was, again, their capital alone that held out. Or at least, it did. Now it was on the verge of its final destruction, for the commandment of the chapter master of the Angels of Midnight had been as predictable as it was complete. All human life on Issacharion was to be wiped out. Of course, but this place, the seat of power, was to be flattened and the ground salted and glassed. But as with everything the Angels of Midnight did, it would be thorough. They had to make sure that every single last Chaos worshipper was dealt with before they took to orbit again and laid it waste. Every single last one purged in the name of their father, the Angel. Forever was the Angel known to give warning, then, if ignored, to lay utter waste to any who denied the power and righteousness of their cause. And thus did his sons, the Angels of Midnight, set about their bloody task. The poor defenseless people of Issacharion were not to be underestimated, however. Or more to put it, their Dark Lord and Master was not. For as they marched into the place after the guard had shelled it for a week without break, the Chaos forces had twisted many a normal human cultist into a travesty. Creatures came charging out of every angle, what were once human. Now all were writhing, screaming things of flesh, horrors to be put down. And in these engagements, the Bolter had, as always, reigned supreme. Yet it was when they came closer to the center of the place that things got worse. For as a last resort, a desperate gamble, the people there had sacrificed a huge proportion of their remaining number in the most terrible ceremonies any had yet performed. But the Angels of Midnight were ready. Their deep midnight blue power armor was no longer proof to every attack from the resisting cultists, no. For now death stalked the city in the form of the Neverborn as well. Creatures of the warp permitted to gain entrance to the material world by this dark ritual. The tactical squad had moved forward, thrusting into this last seat of impurity along with the rest of their company. The sergeant finished scanning around him and ducked down behind the wrecked walls again, between the howls of pain and pleasure that echoed around the entire landscape. There had been deeper rumblings. Something big was on its way. But it was not demonic. It was a very old, battered and barely serviceable demon rust tank. Behind it crept entire walls of twisted scum. For its lack of sheen and polish, the battle cannon on its top was no less lethal, no less destructive. Far from its one large gun barked out and removed much of the cover that it was pointed at. The sergeant knew his men could handle the hordes of scum, knew they would finish them all eventually, be it by bolter or by fist if necessary. But here in the silken darkness was where the angels of midnight had learned to be lords, fighting their twisted brothers of the night for centuries uncounted on a world cut off by the murder storm. They had learned all right. Now they were the kind of terror that usually found itself in the clutches of the vile ones, the corrupting powers. But despite this unceasing hell that they had lived in, they had never broken, had never devolved, never become creatures of unreasoning slaughter, or so most believed. Their millennia-long isolation by warp storm cleared by the tear across the galaxy. But when they were found by the indomitous crusade, they were nearly wiped out themselves, until their true nature was discerned. For they appeared so much like those that they had learned to fight, the masters of the shadows. No Raven Guard were they, certainly, but of all of the sons of Sanguinius, they were those who dwelt in shadows, gained strength from its dark embrace, and they had been absorbed into the crusade, brought back into the Imperium proper, given new Primaris Marines and equipment enough to return them to a full chapter in materials and ships and all of the resources of war they would require to lead their own splinter crusade force. But now, their rage and passion, the love of lord and race and tire, meant that they were the hammer of the Emperor, and they indeed walked where other angels feared to tread. When the tank rumbled to the neck of the road which they moved up, the tactical squad broke and scattered. Like shadows they moved, while one always made distraction and drew the eyes of all. But from one to another would the watcher be drawn, as they took it in turns to scuttle, creep, skulk, and then charge out for a second, always confusing the enemy, until they were closer. All the while, the tactical squad's one heavy weapon was firing down on the tank, missiles hitting more often than not, but then usually seeping into a coloured mist around the tank. Little damage. It was piling up, but it was slow going. A glamour of field erected by the twisted power of its dark master. And it was a distraction as well. After the first missiles were on target and failed to cripple the old fossil, the sergeant knew he would have to get up close and personal with it. Hence the firing of their missile launcher, the bolter rounds, the drawing of attention this way and that. All of it was done by his squad, so the sergeant could get into position. He more than managed this, of course. He was an angel of midnight. And thus it was he found himself 4 stories up, looking down at the rear of the tank as it passed beneath him. He only had one shot at this. It had to be good. The sergeant slowly exhaled, raised his bolter up, but it was not the bark of the Emperor's own wrath, the bolter, that finally rang out. Before the sergeant squeezed the trigger on his weapon, he switched it to its secondary mode. For the gun was rare, and although not as old as many, it had an underslung attachment. A single shot of a powerful melter charge. Just the one. For situations just like this. And when his shot flew out and vaporized the air between him and his target, he knew it would run true. The one melter shot slammed into the back of the tank, exactly where he had wanted it to be, and the effect went into its armor and superheated it until it literally melted. Burning liquid metal dropped into the tank and set off a chain reaction that led to it exploding on the spot. The sergeant stepped back from the window as the tank exploded, then returned again to look down at his handiwork. The vehicle was gone, taking over a score of vile scum with it. But now, said scum were nothing more than a milling and confused mass, and the sergeant drew out his chainsword, hit the one chevron ordering his men to attack, then put his foot on the windowsill and stepped out. He fell down amongst the milling crowd of tainted heretics and cut loose. As he did, his men, all 9 of them, appeared out of corners and shadows and alleyways. None would escape their wrath this day. None. Welcome, gentle listener. I am Baldermort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the important forces, factions, and war gear of the Warhammer 40k universe, the grim darkness of the far future, where there is no time for peace, there is only time for war. And today, we are to discuss one of the most versatile small arms in the setting, the Combi Weapon. But what is a Combi Weapon? Simplicity itself. It is a gun strapped or welded onto another gun, or 2 guns forged and merged into one. The latter is usually the older, due to the technological stagnation and deterioration presently gripping the entire galaxy, with only scant exceptions in the Tau and anything from the shrouded petticoats of Belisarius Core. And so, as usual, for the very basics, let us lean on existing wisdom. To quote, Combi Weapons. Combi weapons are a variety of Space Marine, Chaos Space Marine, and Ork weaponry derived from the integration of multiple different weapon types in a single frame. There are 2 major types of Combi weapon. The first combines 2 identical weapons into one larger weapon, giving the resultant system a higher rate of fire and better accuracy by virtue of simply throwing out more bolts, melter energy, or plasma at the target. The second is an amalgamation of 2 wholly different weapons in a single casing. Only one component of the combined weapon can be fired at a time, and often the secondary weapon has very limited ammunition, usually only enough for a one shot or short burst of fire. Such weapons augment the bearer's tactical flexibility, granting them a limited capacity to deal with threats that the main weapon would find hard or impossible to damage. Astartes Combi Weapons. Astartes Combi Weapons are most often master-crafted weapons and honoured relics of their chapter, venerated for their history and accomplishments, and only entrusted to proven veterans and officers. The Combi Melter, or the Twin-Linked Bolter. Similar to the Storm Bolter, the Twin-Linked Bolter or Combi Bolter is simply 2 standard bolters that have been mechanically combined into a single weapon, rather than having been constructed that way in the first place, like a Storm Bolter. The Combi Bolter was much more common during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy eras, and thus Chaos Space Marines are the most likely to be seen with these weapons. Combi Flamer. A standard bolter with a flamer attachment to the side, useful for close combat. Combi Grenade Launcher. A standard bolter with an underslung grenade launcher that is most useful for assaulting or defending against a large group of friends. And to see this kind of weapon in action, please see the excellent film Aliens 2. So Aliens. Not Alien, that's Aliens. The Combi Melter. A standard bolter with a melter gun attached to its side, used as an anti-armor weapon. Melty, as shown in the story, I hope. The Combi Plasma. A standard bolter with a plasma gun attached that is useful for a variety of tactical necessities. And lastly, a Combi Grav. This relatively rare combi weapon variant incorporates a single-shot Grav gun, allowing the wielder a potent graviton attack when the fighting is fiercest without sacrificing the formidable wrath of the standard bolter. Inquisition Combi Weapons. Incredibly rare. Only some of the forces of the Inquisition are able to use such precious and often one-of-a-kind weapons. Combi Needle Pistol. A bolter with a needler integrated within it. intended to be used against creatures like demons that are extremely difficult to injure. This combi weapon is used by the Inquisitors and Acolytes of the Ordo Malleus. A variant of this combi weapon also serves as a primary weapon of Eversor assassins. The Combi Stake Crossbow. A standard bolter that has been integrated with a crossbow that fires wooden stakes. This weapon has been used by the Initiates and Acolytes of the Ordo Hereticus against rogue psychers. Condemno Bolter. A Condemno Bolter, also called a Condemno Bolt Gun, is an Imperial combi weapon that couples the iconic might of the Imperial Bolter with a secondary launcher in the form of a single-shot crossbow armature that fires blessed silver stakes engraved with sigils of destruction. These are particularly deadly to chaos-corrupted psychers. A direct hit from the crossbow component of the Condemno Bolter will therefore not only deal a severe physical wound to an enemy psyker, it will also send his or her power spiraling out of control, consuming the user in a storm of untrammelled psychic energy. The Condemno Bolter is the ultimate man-portable implement of judgment against those who wield the unclean energies of the warp. It is a weapon favoured almost exclusively by the witch hunter Inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus, such as Inquisitor Greyfax. Ork Combi Weapons. Shooter Scorcher. The Shooter Scorcher is a combi weapon that provides the user with close-range firepower from a flamer on a secondary undermounted barrel beneath the shooter's primary barrel. Shooter Rocket Launcher. The Shooter Rocket Launcher fires a single rocket to be used against enemy tanks and armoured vehicles. Twin-Linked Shooter. The Twin-Linked Shooter is often used by Ork war bosses. It provides greater accuracy than a standard shooter. End quote. Combi weapons. They are some of the most fun things in the game in my humble opinion, because they add so much to the variety of the potential troops' outloads. This weapon, above all others, was instrumental in the survival of many an older or firstborn army of Space Marines, because when the newer, bigger, better equipped Space Marines, the Primaris, were introduced, many saw this as the death knell of the original Marines. Now this may well be in the offing still, I believe, but the timelines have become longer. But all the prognostications aside, in my opinion, it is the combi weapon that has kept the firstborn Marines, the Adeptus Astartes, afloat. For it was very simple in 8th edition. You played the tougher, more efficient Primaris, or you played Firstborn, or you played some combination of the two. Now Firstborn had less endurance, staying power, as they had only one wound to the Primaris too, but they had combi weapons and flexibility. For the standard tactical squad of Firstborns was smaller, weaker, less aggressive than their Primaris successors, but with the use of combi weapons and special or heavy weapons in a small 5-man squad, they were still the most flexible unit in the army, and had the ability to harm near anything that they were asked to face. So it was pure power versus flexibility. Now that the standard Marines all have 2 wounds in 9th edition, are effectively nearly as tough as each other, the difference between Firstborn and Primaris is less stark, less easily explained, and worthy of far greater deliberation while army building. Yet it is still the combi weapon that tips the scales in many a situation. For it means that a sergeant in any squad can have that extra shot of Melter, which of course I would mention first, melty. Or they could have a Flamer to detract from charges, or Plasma, or Grenade or Grav weapon lurking in the unit. Now this is only one weapon, only one squad, but it meant that the small unit of 5 men who are holding onto cover, desperately attempting to hold an objective, or sneaking up one of the flanks, or huddling hunkered down in cover. It meant that the tiny squad of 5 Marines could stand up and fire its heavy weapon or specialist weapon. Then the combi weapon could add its anger. So if you were exceptionally lucky, it could do catastrophic damage to the largest monster, vehicle or beast that stalks the battlefield, and would previously be able to practically ignore the unit of lowly tactical Marines. It made them a threat that could not be underestimated, and a Swiss Army unit that is useful in nearly all situations. as a tactical squad should be. But this can also be applied to the humble assault squad. For in that group of bouncing, supposedly close combat Marines could be a slew of special weapons. Add to that a combi weapon, and you have yourself a cheap elimination unit of moderate ability. But the threat is always high from this type of unit, and the opposition has to take them into account for target priority. I honestly feel that it is the combi weapon that makes the tactical or assault squad shine. Many lead are holding one more than a simple one-dimensional beatstick, and if the wind is blowing in the right direction, nothing is beaming down on you or not, and the dice roll high, well, they can change the outcome of an entire battle. And one battle can tip the balance and decide an entire war. The combi weapon. If you are a Marine, then accept no alternative. Unless it's a full-blown melter or a heavy melter, of course. Again, melty. But this is not where it ends. But the existence of the combi weapon has often been one of the first things that any player or hobbyist will ever attempt to kit bash. Because it is a smaller and limited alteration to a weapon, many feel that they can take that sort of a challenge on, but might be overfaced by a full model conversion. And with the first rather ragged cuts, the first unmatched lines that take hours to perform, involving many a finger and thumb being stuck together, or to the model, unless one is using the newfangled plastic glues, of course, which I highly recommend. So this weapon, the simple cutting off of one bit to add to another to make something so much more than the sum of its parts. This has been the gateway to an amazing and expensive part of the hobby for hundreds. The majestic kit bash. And on that dint alone, I will forever be indebted to this humble weapon. For the models of Games Workshop are amazing, but I always gain a special glow, a deeper grin than any other, when I see someone pouring their all into a model of their own devising, their own imagination. When a fellow fan of Warhammer really lets it all out and plays with the visual lexicon of the grimdark to often create something that the studios themselves could not, or simply would not, create, because of formula or marketability. Total expression. And I love it. Just please, for the love of the Emperor, when you go to perform your first kit bash, remember it is just that. Your first time. Even Picasso or Da Vinci had to learn. And nothing teaches you more and faster than making a monstrosity the first time out. Trust me. Because with each mistake, each error, each failure, your craft will be augmented and your vision more attainable. So when you do, inevitably, get your knives and glue out for the first time, be as gentle with yourself as you would with others. And just know, if you keep at it, if you want it, if you take stock of what went wrong, then one day you may well be designing your own figures. The stars really are the limit. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction to Combi Weapons. If so, then please do consider liking and subscribing. If you do, then hit the notifications button, as I would not want you to miss out. If you see the worth in what we are doing, then do also consider joining our Patreon, or giving the video a share if that is beyond your present scope. It would be a great boon. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.